Hi everyone, thank you for joining us on our live webinar on essentials of medical device. Your presence is highly appreciated and I hope you all are doing great and staying safe in the pandemic situation. Now let me introduce myself first. I am Ankit Shukla, Business Development Manager, Saraca Solutions. And yes, I am your host for today's webinar. Let me tell you some important points related to this webinar. All participants will be muted during the live webinar session. You can note down your questions during the live webinar and ask them after the webinar ends. Or you can also mail your questions to us. We will be happy to share a soft copy of webinar PPT and answers to all of your questions over email. You can also find a recorded version of this webinar and other webinars on our website's webinar page. Our website is www.saracasolutions.com. Now, let me introduce our panelists for today's discussion. So we have two panelists here. First of them is Salman Kapadia. Salman is a Salman has, thank you, Salman. Salman has involved in the medical device design and development for more than 15 years now. And he has designed medical devices for large medical device manufacturers around the globe. Now I will introduce our second panelist, who is MD and CEO of Saraca Solutions as well. His name is Kuldeep Tyagi, and Kuldeep has more than 20 years of experience in medical device industries and other industries. Now, I will request Salman to introduce himself and let's start the webinar. Salman, over to you.
Thank you, Ankit. Thanks for introduction. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you who are joining, who are listening to us today. And thank you very much for joining in. My name is Salman Kapadia, and I have around 15 years of experience in medical device design with startup, with MNCs. And I'll be taking you over essentials of medical device design. So this would be a very general overview of medical device design. And in this, we will have some question and answers after this also. And I'll take you through what is a generic process, in the sense what all is involved in medical device design. So without further ado, let's get started. So let me just go through the agenda for this presentation or this webinar today. First, we'll look at prerequisites for medical device design. Then we'll see what are 5 voices for product development. Then we'll see overview of medical device development. Then we'll talk about phase gate process. What is phase gate process for this? Then let's have a quick look on steps of medical device development. Then a quick look on design controls. Then we'll talk about traceability metrics. Then some of do's and don'ts of medical device development. Again, a generic one. And then last but not least, roles and responsibilities in your design and development process. So let's talk about the prerequisites. What are the prerequisites? So before starting with product development, answer to these following questions will help a great deal in development. So you have your product. Now before even starting, you know what your product you are going to do, but you need to understand, or you need to know who is your user and what your user, what market segment it belongs to, and what your user actually wants. So a good understanding of user is very essential for any product development, and even more for medical devices. So it can be the direct patient, it can be a surgeon who is the user for your device. It can be the end user can be the direct patient itself. So depends. Sometimes nurses are also the user. So it's good to understand the user. Then what does technology says? So you know what you have decided that, okay, this is my business area, or this is my product area. So good to know what technology gaps are there, which you want to understand before even you start. Good to know what current technologies are in the market in that particular domain. Good to know what is the state of art in that particular domain. So then you can decide that, okay, we want to pick on this technology, we want to go ahead with this technology. Then how's the market built up? You want to understand before even you start that how market is like comprising of what kind of competitors are there in the market for that particular product. What is the economies of that market? Is it a high volume product or is it a low volume product? What costs are involved in the market? What user is willing to pay? So all these questions, if you know beforehand, that it will help a lot. Then what is regulatory pathway? So you know which market you will be launching. So you have decided, okay, you want that market to be US or Europe. So then you know that what regulatory pathway is that. So are you going to for 510K or is a PMA, or if you are going for CE, so what requirements are there? Or if you are going for some Asian market, so what regulatory requirements these markets have. So good to know that as well. Then last but not least, what value your product is going to add. So you need to understand that for that particular for that particular feature or that particular technology, there might be 10 different products, but what value you will be adding to your product. So it sometimes it's good to see maybe you that market itself is a very high value market, and even 1% or 2% market share will give you a lot value. So that also can be a value for you. But sometimes there are two or three products in the market, but some new feature you'll be bringing, so that's an add-on value to your product. So good to know, good to target on that as well. And let's move to the
Salman,
next.
Salman,
Yeah,
if I can add one point here, I think
sure.
this is a great slide, and from my experience of many years in working with large companies and smaller size companies, I think these 5 points are very critical. And I have seen that even the large ones miss some of them. For example, the first one which Salman just described. Who is your user? For example, one of the largest medical technology company in orthopedics. We were doing a project for them, and they were developing this device for a knee implant. One of the knee implant system, and for a specific market. But the developers or the designers were for a specific geography. They had very less clue of the other geography, which they never visited. They didn't do a great job in assessing data, anatomical data of that country, and they end up making a product which was not good at all for that particular country. So it becomes very, very important. You assess the users, and in some of the devices, especially in orthopedics, anatomies of Caucasians are different from Asians. It makes a huge difference that you analyze the critical points for your product. I mean, other points are unique as well. Technology, market, regulatory value of your product. Regulatory is a very critical part. It's a changing environment. Every day, regulatory is changing. Earlier it used to be like a couple of years, a big change. Now you see every year there is a change in every country. So it becomes very important that you look at regulatory pathway for your product. Back to you, Salman.
Thank you, Kuldeep. Very good insight. Yeah, so like you said, very essential to focus on all these aspects, and it becomes very challenging if you know these at a later point. It's good to know beforehand.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move to the next. Let's see in detail some of these voices, or these 5 voices. What are these in detail? So user, when we talk about user, what you want to know? Who is your user needs, disease state. There could be more in that user list, but these are some of them which I have listed. So disease state, you want to understand fully, like what kind of disease state you're targeting. So if you talk about regulatory, then the intended use you want to define you clearly. Then you want to look at some of the clinical data which is present, some complaint data for that particular device which is there in the market. So all these are published in the public domain, so you can get the clinical data for the competitor's device in the market. Then the geographies, So like I said, like Kuldeep also mentioned, different geographies have different regulatory pathway. So that is also very important. Then technology state of the art, like I mentioned, the knowledge gaps that you want to know what knowledge gaps are existing. If you have some unique technology, then it's also very good. Then you can place your product differentially in a market. It can be a differentiator for you. Then intellectual property is also very essential. So if, for example, you're planning to launch certain product or you have certain ideas, so it's good to see, do you have what kind of freedom to operate you have in the market? What is white space or white area in that market? Are you, or your product or your technology or your design, will that cause intellectual property? Will it cause any conflict in that? So it's good to know that as well. Then value, what patient experience, what value will add to the patient experience, talks about that. Then operational efficiency, what kind of efficiency you'll be building with that, with your product. So in the, compared to the current products in the market, will you have something better in terms of efficiency? Then I'll talk about the market, so competitive landscape, spoke about that. Healthcare economics, so in some of the countries, the some of the products in medical devices are generally driven by the reimbursement patterns. So you also want to look at that. What kind of cost are insurance providers willing to pay for that product? So that also sometimes becomes a decision making factor in launching the product, or in providing those features. For example, the user, it's not the user who is making the decision, is the reimbursement company or the insurance company making the decision. So then you need to understand that as well. And the target cost, so what would be the target cost you'll have? So that is also very essential. Let's move to the next slide. So here I'm going to give you a bird's eye view of what all involves in medical device. So medical device development. In a very, this slide will give you a very brief or very in a summary what all it talks about it. So let's see. So what exactly you want to do in a simple, in a very simple form, what exactly you are going to do? Define what user wants. So now you have defined what actually, you know, your user, you have all the voices. Now you have defined what your user is actually wanting. With user need, customer requirements, you have already said that. Now you now you have to decide how you are going to provide that, what your user is asking. So how you are going to provide that. For that, you'll have product specs, system specs, your design output, and your actual product. How you make it safe. So you'll do risk management, you'll do usability review over that. And the fourth step would be test and show that number one, the user wants or user needs are satisfied by implementing the number two, your products. So here the user, what user is asking is being satisfied by the product you have built. How you do that? By design verification and design validation. So this is a kind of a cheat sheet, I would say, for medical device development. So we'll see each of these steps in detail next slides. So medical device development itself is a phase gate process. So first you start, so you have a pre-assessment, I would say, phase 0, in which like we discussed earlier, you have all the requirements, you have you know the user, you know what regulatory pathway you have, you know what technology, market value, everything you know. So you will see, does all this is making a business sense or not? So that would be the gate 1 initial screening. Then after that, once you are okay that makes sense to go ahead with that, then you go into the planning phase. So in that, you product design and development planning, you start with planning how much time it will take, what are the resources required for design and development, how to proceed, what are the timeline we are looking at. So all this good to have all the plan in this stage, so that with some buffer also, so that you know that if something goes wrong, we will be able to at least achieve this timeline. Then again, after you have planned, there's a reviewer. You can ask somebody from outside of the organization or some third party to review whatever planning you have, or maybe the upper management itself is sometimes the gatekeeper. In bigger organization, upper management is the gatekeeper. In startups, sometimes the investors are gatekeepers. So that can be reviewed by a third party or a individual reviewer or independent reviewer, and then you can move on to your product and process design and development. So in this phase, actually you will actually, formally I would say, you'll start with compiling your user requirements in terms of marketing specification or user requirement specification. So it will be a document in which you have all the requirement in terms of functionality, in terms of ergonomics, in terms of safety, in terms of regulatory, labeling, packaging, all points you'll have to list down in this particular phase. So those are your design input. And then after your product and so we see all the details of these phases in the next slides. We'll just talk about what all phases are there in this slide. So now you have design freeze, you have all the design data, you have created your product. Now you'll again have a design review, and then you'll move into design verification phase. So like in the earlier slide, we saw that the phase one, you have your what planning you did your planning, and you have all the information. Phase two, you develop your product. Now phase three, you want to prove that whatever you have developed is as per specification or not. And events once you enter phase four, so that is design validation. In that, you will see that whatever product we have made, is it meeting the user requirement or not. So you'll take your product to the user and ask the questions that whatever user need you had initially, is the product meeting that or not. And then once you are okay with that, then you can go into production. Full scale production and post production support is the fifth phase. So throughout this phase, feedback, assessment, corrective and preventive action will go throughout this phase. So at any phase, if you feel that, okay, this we want to add something or something has gone wrong, so there could be a continuous feedback and continuous corrective and preventive action can be taken over. Let's go to next slide.
Salman,
In this slide,
Salman, if I can add just like few
sure.
sentences on this, I think this is a great slide which talks about 5 typical gates. But the company you are working in, you might have a different naming of the gates, you might have different nomenclature, but at the end of the day, you want to make sure that you follow your quality management system based on either FDA 21 CFR Part 820 or ISO 13485 2016. But it is very critical to make sure that you move to next gate once you are done with the previous gate. Many times people make mistakes that let me start the next one before completing the previous one, and that creates challenges when you go over to the phase 5. You will see some of the challenges which you would not have realized. So you have to be very strict. I think your quality assurance function has to be very strict in ensuring that you move to the next phase once you complete the previous one. But I just want to add, you might have different nomenclature. That doesn't matter. But I think intent what Salman is trying to convey here is that you have to make a procedure and you have to sort of follow that and ensure that each gate each review at the gate is very important.
Thank you, Kuldeep. Thanks for adding that point. Yeah, so let's have a look in detail each of these phases. So pre-assessment, you collect the voice of customer as we discussed. Feasibility studies, you do quick prototypes, quick checking with the technology, everything whatever you're thinking is working or not. And selection of gatekeepers, who will be your reviewers, like we already discussed. In MNCs, there could be a different department or a different I would say management would be the gatekeepers. So and so forth. The opportunity screening is again, you will see what all you can divulge with this current technology. So that is opportunity screening. Then IP landscaping, we already talked about that. Technology mapping is again different technologies which can be used for this, but to solve that particular problem statement. So you have that problem statement defined, and now you have different technologies. So which technology is very efficient, or which technology is cost effective? So all those things can be done at this stage. Then competitive benchmarking, understanding what features competition is providing. So all those things you can do with competitive benchmarking. Then cost versus benefit analysis. So again, that is the part of value, what value you are adding to the customer, what cost you are providing, and what is the feature or extra feature which you are providing. So this is again pre-assessment. Then we'll go into planning, the project team formation. You decide on your resources, who will be working in what kind of resources you will require. Are you going to outsource the some of the part, or you are going to do in-house? So all those decisions are part of your project team formation. Then creation of design history file. Design history file will have all the design related data which will be kept in your whatever you will be doing the design and development. So all that will be part of design history file. Then preparation of product design and development plan. So development plan itself will talk about what all you will be deciding, what standards you will be following, what regulatory pathway, what markets you will be going in. So all this will be part of design and development plan. And design and development plan will also talk about, like Kuldeep mentioned in the earlier slide, like who will be your reviewers, or at which stage you will be doing your design reviews or other reviews. So all this will be decided and uh, with a pre assessment this will be mentioned in your design and development plan. Then a preliminary project review, and again that after that review of that your plan and product and development plan, you move to next stage, which is the actual design stage. So in this, like I earlier said, you'll formulate your user needs spec. You will list down all the specification which goes into user needs. So user needs are again divided into functional needs or performance need, and then regulatory, the ergonomics, usability needs, packaging, labeling, supply chain, reliability, serviceability. So all this will be part of user need requirement. And similarly, if it's a big system, then it's sometimes called system requirement specification. And then you will translate your user need into product specification. So product specifications are a quantitative specification. So user needs are generally qualitative, but product specification will have some numbers to your user needs, which you can actually measure, or that you will verify in design verification. Then comes the concept design, various kind of concept design, system design, then detailing, prototyping at this stage to see how the system is performing. Then comes the design out. Once you have the final detailed design, then the design output is your CAD and 2D drawing. So corresponding to each product specification, you'll have some design output, and that will be part of your 2D drawing and CAD. Then after you have all these in place, then you'll go for design reviews. Then you'll, at the same time when you're doing your design, you'll have the manufacturing process in your mind, what manufacturing process you'll be going for that, because you already have your 2D drawings and you know which process they will be manufactured in. So all that will be at this stage. Then prototype building, testing and review. Then at this stage only you will decide how you are going with what plan you will have for design verification. So you'll make a test plan at this stage. Then you'll have sampling plan based on your risk management. So risk management is very essential part at this stage. But risk management I have listed risk management here, but risk management generally has to be started a bit early depending on the organization. So sometimes you have you have your user specification. Formally it starts from this stage, but it's good to have if you started before. So some organizations, there's a requirement to have a preliminary hazard analysis. So generally it's a very start of, so you have a use flow, and from use flow you have a preliminary hazard analysis, but the formulation or the formal document is completed at this stage. Then you have test after you have your DV test plan. So DV test plan also says about your test method creation, that then test method validation. So all this is linked to your risk management. So you have your hazard analysis and you have your DFMEA. So what kind of sampling plan you are going to choose. So everything is linked to your product specification and what are the risks of your product specification, if any, if you have identified those risks. So how you are mitigating those by design. So sometimes requirement is that, for example, if some feature or some uh, uh, design requirement is a higher risk, so you'll have a higher so sampling plans is linked to that. So in that case, you'll have a higher number of sampling plan. So this stage you'll have all this ready. So because once you exit this stage, so all whatever listed here should be at a completion stage. Then once we go to verification stage, so you'll have a formal verification testing starts phase. So here, whatever the product specification you had set, so for each corresponding product specification, you must have a test method. So how are you going to test that product specification? For example, uh, if you talk about length of certain certain dimension or certain dimension in your product, for example, length of certain cannula. So that for that particular thing, you'll need to have what equipment you'll use, what uh, sampling plan you'll have, and what is my acceptance criteria. So all this will be listed in your uh, test method. So you, according to that test method protocol, you will test all your specification, and then you'll compile the DV test report. So this all will be part of your design history file, and this will all be presented as per the regulatory requirement also. So at this stage, this is also a good stage to start pre-production tooling. Then pre-production, so DV parts also, sometimes in some organizations, the parts for DV itself are from pre-production tool, or sometimes when you're taking it from pre-production tool, so there's one more requirement of part characterization, so that you can make sure that whatever parts you'll be getting after a production tool matches your DV parts, design verification parts. Then after this stage, we'll go into a sorry, that's a miss type here. That's a validation. So in validation, you'll now you have the product either by a pilot manufacturing or a full tool production. So you have your product. Now you'll take your product into the market and to the user actually. So you already have defined what user base or what sample you'll have for validate your product. So you will take your product to all those user and ask the feedback that are you meeting the user requirements or not. So it's a complete cycle which will complete here like a chain. And once you have your deval test report, so everything is fine, then you can move ahead with the final production and later final production and supply chain to that. Let's go to next
I think
slide.
this is a great slide,
Yeah,
Salman. I would like to just add one point here, as you pointed
sure.
out that risk management is in design phase, and as you rightly said, it depends on your quality management system. Many companies are starting risk management very early as possible. But what we have seen recently in we do a lot of reviews of our customers' design files, risk management files. What we have found that the new standard of risk management in ISO 14971 2019 version has very critical elements. It's a major change in the standard. So if you and your company has not adopted the latest risk management procedure, I think you should do it as soon as possible. Just to give an example, one of the tech file audit we did for one of our customers, the notified body has found 9 non-conformances, and out of those 9, 5 are related to risk management. I think earlier, we said that we have identified the risk, we have a mitigation, and my job is done. I think they're not stopping there. You need to have effectiveness of those mitigations. Are there risks emerging from those mitigation steps? Have you really included them? And you also need to see, are they really effective in your process? And not only that, how are you auditing those effectiveness? In your internal audits. Many times you make these risk management files and you only look at them when you get post-market surveillance data from either it's proactive or reactive, and if you have an incident which triggers an update to RMF, then only you will do update to your RMF. But that's no more accepted now. You will have to look at your risk management file, keep continuing based on your internal audit, external audit, or any change you see in your process or your proactive or active post-market surveillance, you will have to come back and keep it updating to ensure that it is safe and effective. Many times we do not, the mistakes we do many times, let's say if I have a risk which is at level 4 when I started my product, and because there were so many uncertainties, there were so many unknowns when I was developing product, but now product is already in the market. I do not have any complaint on that risk which I have foreseen when I was developing that product. So why do you have 4 now? Right? It needs to be reduced to 3 or 2 based on your project team's assessment. So you need to come back and assess that. Similarly, some of the risks you might have at a lower level, but you are getting a lot of complaints. Are you coming back to your DFIMA, PFIMA, or fault tree analysis, any technique, whatever you use, and increasing that risk so that you do a good assessment. We had FD audit about a year ago, just before COVID, and one of the major non-conformance from FDA was that there were a lot of complaints on one of the line items in DFIBA, and our customer did not realize to update the risk management file. Because of that incident, they got a major non-conformance. Somehow they survived, not shutting down the plant, but it was a major non-conformance which had to be redo. Like almost 6-7 people had to work on 5-6 months to correct that. But if you would have taken steps at the right time, this would have been just a quick update and go from there. So I think risk management is very critical. It's becoming critical as we go along and as regulations are changing. But my one-liner would be that you have to quickly get up to speed on 14971 2019, which is the latest version. It is a major change in the regulation from the previous one. Over to you, Salman.
Thanks, Kuldeep. Thanks to give that much of information. So actually, yeah, you rightly said risk management itself is a vast topic. So I remember there was a very good webinar on risk management as well. So feel free to, there's a link on Saraca's website. So if somebody wants, they can actually go to and see the risk management itself.
Absolutely.
So let's go to the next slide. So let's see the design controls in terms of what FDA and ISO 13485 has to say. So actually design control is a very, what is design control? Is just to prove that what you have designed is a safe product and it meets your user requirements. So basically in a very simpler form, that actually is the design control. So the process which we spoke about in earlier slides is actually a part of design control. So how you work throughout your design is a part of design control. So every regulatory body or every regulatory authority will have their own set of design controls which everybody or the organization needs to follow if you are compliant to that regulatory requirements. So this is a general overview of what FD has to say on what is 13485 has to say. So generally the QMS on the companies are tailored to these requirements. Like we already have seen this requirement in previous slides. So this is in terms of what they have to say. So if you see, it's very similar between similarities between FDA and 13485. So in terms of that, so I can just read that. So all the requirement, all the clauses are very similar in terms of what they actually need and how that has to be followed in design control. So this talks about all the design controls, like all the phases. For example, starting with design and development planning, like we discussed, design input, output, then reviews, what kind of reviews at what stage you want to do, verification, then validation, then design transfer, changes, if you have some changes in your design at any stage, then what process has to be followed to incorporate that change into your design. So at what stage you have that change and what process needs to be followed. So that is also defined in these clauses. Then there's a design history file. So most of the time, regulatory body, like for example, if it's if you're talking about US FDA, so then these are the requirements, and if you're talking about 13485, these are the other requirements. And for most of the other, I think regulatory requirements, there could be slight difference in terms of what is required, but more or less these are same. Kuldeep, you want to add something on this one, on design
So I
controls?
think no, that's really good. Just a quick information to our audiences that in future it looks like FDA will be adopting ISO 13485 as their
Oh,
quality management system. And as we foresee that the efforts of harmonization and making one standard worldwide, the reopening standards, the current one MDR is getting more penetration around the world. But I think you will, if you're in US and you're just following FDA, I think it's a time to start following 13485 2016, which has been updated to great extent in the 2016 version. And in future, perhaps this will be the worldwide standard for quality management system. Over to you, Salman.
thank you. Thanks, Kuldeep. Let's go to the next slide. So here I'll be talking about briefly about the traceability matrix. So traceability matrix, as the name suggests, a document with links user need from the start till validation in the end. So generally, if you have this document, there are a lot of ways in which you can document your user needs each stage. You can have a separate document for user needs. You can have then product specification and so forth, so on and so forth. But this one document, if you have, then you'll have all the linkages from the start till the end, so that some auditor, if you present this document, so somebody can see a whole picture in one go. So let's have an example, a very quick example. So let's talk about hypodermic needle. So this needle, I think everybody might have seen. It's a very common medical device. It's a class 2 device, and it's a very common ubiquitous device, I would say. So let's see how a typical traceability matrix will look for this device. So for example, the user need says to reach hypodermis. Now, this is a very basic need in which this could not be from VOC, or this can be from VOC, but this is generally a driven requirement in which the basics is for this medical device is to reach the hypodermis. So when this needle is penetrated in the skin, it should minimum reach the hypodermis. So this is our requirement. This is a user need. So for each user need, it's good to list what is your source of that user need. It can be voice of customer, it can be competitors analysis, it can be regulatory requirement, it can be standard requirement. So those can be your sources of VOCs. So now you want to convert that user requirement into design spec or design input. So what could be the user or the design input for that particular user needs? For example, to reach hypodermis, what you need a tube with some diameter and some tolerance on the diameter. What else you need? You need that length of the trocar tip, so that it, and the angle on the trocar tip, so that you can penetrate the skin. So these are some examples of how you convert the user need into quantitative requirements, so that you can actually measure that, and those requirements are related, and those requirements define how will you achieve your user need. So you want to achieve user need, and how you'll achieve that by these design input requirements. Now again, when I say outer dia, so why I am saying outer dia, then you have to give a rationale. It could be a standard, it could be a research paper, it could be engineering calculation, it could be your internal testing. So those could be your rationales to define design input. Now, like I said initially, for each design input, you need to have a test method, how you are going to measure on your final product, how you are going to measure that this is the diameter. So then test method, you'll specify which equipment you'll use. For example, I'll use a micrometer or a gauge, whatever I'm going to use. So that I have to specify in my test method with my acceptance criteria. Then comes the design output. So design output is your drawing, your CAD model. So in my CAD model or in my drawing, in my 2D drawing, I'll specify the diameter of this cannula. So that now diameter of my cannula is linked to my user needs. So that's how I have created the linkage. Now in the next column, we'll go for DV test report. So you'll again test this particular uh, auto dia according to your test method. So now you have your test method defined, and now you have your product. So you will test it and report it in your DV report. And similarly, the next would be DVAL. DVAL is design validation. So in design validation, you will actually see if you'll see if you are reaching the hypodermis or not. So you'll have to define or design a test in which you can prove that you will actually are able to do that, or actually that product is meeting the user need or not. So this is a snapshot, I would say, of a traceability matrix. So it's from the start, what was the user need and how we validated that need. So all is covered in a matrix. So this actually is a very good tool, I would say, from my experience, what I have seen in companies. There are various different tools. So each and every tool has their own pluses and minuses. But this particular tool actually, to a designer, to a technical person, this gives an overall view, and this it helps you to track each and every requirement. And some organizations I have also seen, there's a one more column in which you can actually specify you can specify the linkages to your risks in this particular thing. So uh, it helps in tracking all the requirements so that you don't miss any requirement in the end, or you don't have, or maybe this also helps in to see the linkages to trace the document. So you have the document number in each of, for example, design output. So I have my drawing number there. So it's also very good to see all the linkages and all to see if you are missing something or not. So from that perspective, I feel from my experience, this tool is very good tool for complete process.
I think this is
Let's
really
go to,
good,
yeah.
Man. And I think I'll just add one quick thing. I think this is one document which not only helps designer engineers or manufacturers, also helps auditors. I think one of
Right.
we are in a regulated industry, and from my experience, I have seen that many great products have not seen the market, and one of the reason for that is that they did not had enough documentation. You know, some of the great engineers, they developed great products, but they were not good in documenting that. And since we're in a regulated industry, if you're not able to document, how would you prove to the auditor that your product is great? From that aspect, this documents is really helpful, because from the start, as Salman said, from VOC to your final output, it has everything very easily understandable. It's like a bird's view of explaining that, hey, this was my requirement and this is my output, and then auditor can come back and ask subsequent questions. You can pull up a drawing, but it's easier for you. Many times I've seen that when auditor asks question, if you yourself are not organized, it becomes very hard for you to pull the data. And if you're not able to pull data in time, that creates doubt. And when that creates doubt, the auditor's confidence goes down on yourself. So this traceability metrics, as Salman said, is good for design, but it's good for subsequent phases. It becomes your life easier when you have launched your product and you are going through an audit. What do you, Salman?
Thanks, Kuldeep. Yeah, very good points you have highlighted. So this is a very, like we have already said, uh, this is a very good document, and we encourage to have this kind of document so that at each and every stage you can satisfy all the stakeholders in your process. Let's go to next slide. So let's talk about some do's and don'ts of medical device development. Again, these are some general one. There can be lot depending on what device is there, what actually you are planning to, which regulatory pathway you are trying to take. So in general, this talk about what could be good practices and what should you avoid in design and development. Let's see do's first. So like we already discussed, make sure your product solves some market need. So this is again depending on if you have already defined your voices. So you might have a very good technology at your hand, a very unique thought at your hand, but if it's not adding some market need or it's not solving some market need, then to prove that thing in the market to actually become successful or commercially successful, it will take a lot of time. But if your product or if your technology or if your thought or your idea is solving some market need, then it will see a ready acceptability in the market. So it's good idea to see uh, if you're solving any market need or not. So let's see another. So define the product spec with test in mind. So like already discussed in traceability matrix, then that whatever product specs you are defining, at the end you will have to test it and prove it that you're meeting those or not. So define product spec in such a way that you can actually test it. So you need to keep in mind what equipment I would require, how I'm going to test that. For example, if you define certain thing which is very difficult to measure, then that product spec itself is very challenging to measure and you have now risk of failing. For example, if it's a very tight tolerance, or for example if it's a very if it's a product specification itself is a very difficult to measure, so there are high chances that if something goes wrong, then you'll have a failure at that point. So very important to define product specification such that keeping in mind that how you are going to test it. So it's very essential. So from my experience, I would say sometimes it's become such a challenge that later you have to change your product specification because it's very difficult to actually test that particular thing. Let's go to next. Think of human factors from the beginning. So human factors is how it will interact with your device, the usability part, the usability engineering, and the ergonomics part. So very good idea to think about the human factors in the beginning itself. So for example, like Kuldeep already mentioned, that you need to understand the users from each geographies. So user from geography A will be different from user from geography B. So you need to understand if you are targeting to launch in those two geographies, then you need to understand the user from there and how they interact with the device. So it's good to incorporate all those factors from the beginning itself. Then prototype your concepts early on. Good idea to prototype early on, no matter how design or how detailed your design is. So sometimes the design is not that detailed. So it's good idea to do some early mock-ups depending on in different process itself. So you can go for 3D printing, you can go for very rough prototypes. So that will give a good confidence to the stakeholders as well, and you'll get to learn a lot of things from the prototypes so that you can incorporate that in your design. One good idea to keep your manufacturing process early on. So you know that this particular device I'm going to manufacture in this particular way. So it helps the designer or helps the design team to understand what are the challenges with that manufacturing process, what specification we need to keep in mind, and what cost are we going to look at. So all this will be depending on the manufacturing process itself. So for example, there could be molding is one injection molding is, for example, one manufacturing process. So you may decide, okay, the volume is not that high, so we might go for 3D printing itself. So that is also one of the cost deciding factor. So to keep the manufacturing process in mind, let's have a look at some things which you should avoid. So one thing is, don't wait for quality system implementation till end. So like Kuldeep also pointed out that nowadays it's very rigorous to go. So for example, you have a very nice product in the end, if you have certain certain things which are missing in that, or if you're not following certain quality systems, or you're not following as per regulatory requirements, then all the efforts which you have putting to develop that product might go down the drain. So it's very essential to keep keep the quality system from the start. For example, it's a small organization, you're a startup, so it's not necessary to have a complete system from the day one, but you can build on the quality system as you go. So but it's good to it's good to start from the beginning for the quality systems. Other potential thing to avoid is don't overlook potential human errors. So for example, there are a lot of chances in your device that in actually when you are doing the usability engineering, you see that this particular feature, there can be a user error or a human error. So all those risks you should understand at the beginning, and you should try to mitigate those risks as quickly as possible. For example, you can have some design feature which can mitigate those risks, which can avoid human errors. Next would be, don't neglect the standards and regulations. So regulations we already spoke about, but there are some standards also which in certain geographies need to follow. For example, if you say this particular feature or this particular device is following these standards, then it in itself gives the confidence to the user, to your end user, or to the auditing body, that okay, you are following this standard and your device is complying to those standards. So it's good idea to see in your domain what are the standards which are applicable to your device. Let's see. So expect user to know the obviouses. So for example, when designers are designing the some product, so they already know how it's going to actually perform, or how it's going to operate. But from the user's perspective, so your user base is a varied user base. You'll have, for example, users from various different demographics, different age group. So you need to understand how those users are thinking. So for a designer, or for a somebody who's already designing the product, some of the features or some of the things are very obvious. Okay, this is the only way we'll do. But that is as per our subconscious. Sometimes the end user will try to do things very differently. So it's good to understand, or good to think from the user's perspective. Last but not least, avoid documenting things as required. So it's not like you should document everything which is required from the beginning. So it's a very good saying in the regulatory world that if something is not documented, that means not done. So good to document each and everything from the start, and good to document as per the requirements. So these are some of the basic do's and don'ts. Kuldeep, if you want to add on this, on some of these.
I think you have covered really well, Salman.
Okay, thanks. Let's go to next slide. So here I'm talking about roles and responsibilities and how to manage the stakeholders in the design. So let's see who all will be part of your design and development process. This can be again varied depending on how your organization is structured. Depending if for example, it's a startup, then it will be very different. If it's MNC, this will be very different. So depending on the organization mix, it will be different who you actually are playing your stakeholders. So let's see. So first would be the marketing, I would say. So again, in some organization, marketing is a separate department for upstream marketing to get the user feedback or to get the customer requirement. But in certain organization, the designer itself or the person who is developing the product itself plays the role of marketing. Then the quality. So now you have design team, but I think the quality team should be independent of your design. Sometimes they could not be, it's not possible to have a different quality department, but even a single person who is overlooking the design requirements for design quality assurance, for supplier quality, for quality systems. So this can be a very essential tool. as you go in design and development. Then the design department, which would be product design or packaging, labeling. Sometimes a single person will be doing all these activities. Sometimes that there's a team for packaging, there's a team for labeling, there's a team. So depending on again on the organization, this particular function will work. Then again the process. So it's an internal decision to outsource the manufacturing. And in some cases the manufacturing is in-house. So the manufacturing or the process engineering becomes your stakeholder in that aspect. And regulatory. So regulatory, to help with the process of regulatory filing, sometimes the regulatory requirements or regulatory process itself is outsourced to another organization, and sometimes there are internal teams for that. Then comes the supply chain. Supply chain is again once you complete your design and development and you understand what markets you are going into, so you'll have to decide supply chain. So again, this can be an external stakeholder or that can be an internal stakeholder as well. So these are some of the stakeholders, and it's good idea to have roles and responsibilities defined in the early on. So design and development plan itself requires you to define who is responsible for what. So for example, marketing, the role, who will be playing that role for the marketing, for getting the insights, who is your design quality assurance person, who will be working as a design lead, and who will be working in the manufacturing side, who's in the regulatory side. So all these you have to define very clearly in design and development plan. These can be external agencies also. There can be internal person also. Sometimes I've seen some startups that multiple roles are played by a single person. So that is also sometimes possible. It's not like it's not possible, but in some organization that is also possible. So these are basics of roles and responsibilities, and the only takeaway from this is it's good to define it early on. So that's what it's a to avoid friction at the later end. So it's good to define roles and responsibilities at the early on. So any input from you, Kuldeep?
I think this looks good, Salman. You have covered all.
Thanks. So this ends the webinar, or on the topics which we have covered. So we spoke about 5 voices for product development. We saw the process of medical device development. What's the process? How it goes through all the phase gate process. Then we saw the steps of medical device development. We had a brief look on design controls as per regulatory requirement. Then we saw an example of traceability matrix, and then we spoke about some do's and don'ts of the medical device development. So basically this sums up the design and development, how a medical device should be developed. This was a very generic overview. I understand for different devices, different technologies, you have to tailor your requirement as per your needs. So depending on what product or what manufacture or what technology you are focusing on, so you'll have to have your design controls tailored to your requirements. So Kuldeep, if you want to add any point here.
No, I think this was really good, Salman. I think it's a good overview of developing a medical device product. Obviously, there are a lot of other standards which you need to follow, but I think this is a good base, solid ground to have when you develop a medical device product. Thanks for doing it, Salman.
Thank you very much, Kuldeep. Over to you, Ankit.
Thank you, Salman. Thank you, Kuldeep. Guys, now you can ask your questions on chat box, or you can just raise your hand. I will unmute you and you can ask your questions via audio as well. So Salman, as I can see, we have a couple of questions.
Okay.
Sarthak is asking, what is DHF?
So DHF is design history file. So design history file is, like I said before, design history file, you'll have all the requirements from the start, from your user requirement till your end design validations. So everything will be in your design history file. So design history file will be submitted while to a regulatory body, so that when you'll go for your filing, so they'll ask for DHF. So it will have from everything from the start till the end, so that they'll get a complete picture.
I have
Thank
a
you,
few
Salman.
questions which they have asked me. Ankit,
Yeah,
so maybe you can cover yours and then I'll take mine. Are you okay with
sure.
that?
Yeah, sure. So now I have one more question from Tarun. Tarun is asking, what's the scope of new device development for an organization? This is part of the question. And then again, continuing, is it always feasible to go for a new product development?
Sorry, so what is the scope of design and
New
development for an
device,
organization?
medical, yeah.
So, so what I understand from the question is, for example, if you talk about the scope, so if that particular organization is owner of the device, or some organization wants to develop the device, so for that organization, the scope will be the throughout, from the product from the user inputs to design validation. So they'll have to cover all the aspects of design. So I believe I'm answering your question. So is that what you want to ask?
Yeah, I think
So yeah.
you were right, yeah. And we have other question from Tarun as well. Whether a new medical device development includes new software development for the device as well or not?
Yeah, software development itself is a part of medical device development. Some in a lot of the devices, software is also is a part of your system requirement specifications. For example, when I said user requirements, so user requirements, like I mentioned, functional requirement, performance requirement. So there's one thing which is software requirement. So software requirement itself, there are a lot of standards and there are a lot of regulations required from regulatory body. Uh, I think in this particular decade, software played a very essential role in medical devices, and sometimes software itself is the main thing in a medical device. So it's like a brain in a medical device. So the risk associated with that again becomes a very essential part of that. So yes, to answer your question, software is a very integral part of any medical device. And like we listed down the user requirements for, so like we converted user requirement into product specs. So a user requirement can also be converted into a software requirement specification. So that software requirement specification will be met by some type of code or some type of algorithm, and then again it will be tested in design verification with some method. So software is very essential part, I would say, and it
I
falls
think I
into
have a
your design controls.
absolutely. I have a related question from Eric Enstead. He is asking what is the standard we need to follow if we are developing a software product. Is it okay if I answer that question, Salman?
Yeah, sure, please go ahead.
Yeah, sure,
Sure.
Kuldeep, sure.
I think Eric, you will have to follow IC 62304, SDLC, Software Development Lifecycle Management, for software development. But you will have to also follow ISO 13485 2016. So it has to be a combination. ISO 13485 provides you the base of management control, and IC 62304 provides you a framework for software development lifecycle. There is
Maybe
one more
Kuldeep,
question I have. Yeah, please go ahead.
maybe you can add, if this is just an app and there's no physical device, so the app itself sometimes, and nowadays depending on what this app is doing, for example, it's app on your iPhone, so in itself is considered sometimes medical device. So for that, actually you'll have to follow all those requirements, if I'm not wrong.
No, you're absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. I think initially, a couple of years ago, it was very challenging for folks to understand that your app can also be a medical device, and you need to follow IC 62304. So that's a great example you just mentioned, Salman. There's another question from Paul Boscher. Paul is asking what is the major difference between ISO 14971 2019 and 2003. So I think, Paul, there are a couple of differences which I will mention, but for detail, I think you can go to our company page, and there is a 1.5-hour webinar on this topic. One of the major change in the new standard is effectiveness of your risks. As I said earlier in the webinar, that your mitigation itself is not enough. So effectiveness measurement is very important. That's a major change which they have added. And earlier days, I think if you're doing FMEA, that's more than enough. But now that is not enough. You will have to adopt at least one or two more techniques. It could be fault tree analysis, it could be something else in your system to ensure that you are covering risks from the all sides of your product. There is one more question I have from Eric Amstead. Eric is asking about, I think he's asking question on your phase gate process. He's asking where would the testing comes in those 5 gates. Do you want to explain that question?
Yeah. So Eric, there are different types of testing. So one is design verification testing, which is the formal testing of your product, whatever product you have made. So formally which you test is a design verification testing, and that comes in phase 4, the design verification stage. So in design verification stage, you will actually test your product. But the other testing can be design freeze testing. So some organizations, before even exiting the design development phase, so they want to make sure that whatever they have designed is meeting the requirement or not. So those testing is their internal testing. So those testing data from those testing might not go to the regulatory authority when they submit that for the audit, but the DV or design verification data definitely has to go to regulatory body. So that is a formal testing. That's why I said it's a formal testing. But there can be very number of internal testing which the organization do for their confidence. So for example, the design team wants to do some kind of test to understand their confidence. So once they exit the design phase, so they exit with confidence that okay, their product is meeting the requirement or not. And when they go into design verification phase, they are confident that okay, we have already tested internally and all the tests are passing, so we can go ahead. So yeah, so for to answer your question, design verification is the formal testing, but there can be testing at many stages: prototype stage, your internal testing stage, or design freeze stage.
Sounds good. I think there are a few more questions from Paul Boscher, but I think we're running over the time. Maybe Paul, we will answer your question on email. I think he has 3-4 more questions. We can answer. Ankit, back to you. Maybe you can cover 1 or 2 questions from your side, and then we can wrap up because we are almost 10 minutes over.
Yes, thank you, Kuldeep. I think we can answer those questions over email. We can cover one more question. How medical device NPD is different from other industries NPD? Salman.
Okay, so let me give my view, then maybe Kuldeep you can add. So medical devices, they are a specific, like we already discussed, design controls. If you, for example, majorly design controls are tied to the regulatory authority or regulatory requirements of that particular country. For example, if I am designing for US, so I have to comply to US FDA. So and if I, for example, maybe if you talk about European MDR, so ISO 13885 are the requirements in majority of the part of the world. So medical device development, you have to comply to these requirements, and these requirements define your design controls. For example, risk management also. So for risk management, we already have already discussed, there's a standard ISO 14971. So these are requirements for medical devices. For uh, other industries, for example, aerospace, automobile, there might be some different standards. They might be following the process which is very similar, like you have user input and you have design validation at the end. So you are following the same process, but the requirement are, I would say, from my experience, it's very stringent in medical devices, because now you have to comply to these regulatory requirements, and then you have, once you go through the audit, then you have to prove that you are meeting these requirements. That's my understanding. Kuldeep, if you want to add.
I think that's great. You have just explained, Salman. I can just add one or two more things. I think if you aerospace industry comes closer to medical devices, because aerospace is also heavily regulated. And I think, as Salman said earlier, documentation is very important. So many people does not realize, folks who come from consumer industry or industrial industry or semiconductor, they find it very difficult in medical devices, because here documentation is very intense, which may not be there in the other industries. So I think it becomes very critical, if you have had a lot of experience with other industries which are not heavily regulated, and you're moving to medical, just make sure that you will have some challenges, because there is a high level of documentation. I can give an example. When I started working in medical devices, I was in automotive, and my first project was to design a pedicle screw system, and it already existed. I wanted to extend line to add one more diameter, and it was my early days. I thought it would be just a couple of weeks, because that's what you typically do in automotive, to design a screw. Believe it or not, it was almost 10 months to complete that project, with intense discussions with the stakeholders. That's when I realized that it is not just technology which makes a medical device. It's a risks. It's the feedback from clinical staff, be it surgeon, be it nurses, doctors. It's a development which encompasses like users in the development. In most cases, other industries, you may not have user involved so much in the design and development, but in medical, users are involved. As you know, validation is not done without users. So it is very unique, it is different, and it has its own challenges. But I think once you understand the basics of what Salman explained in today's webinar, it becomes very interesting, to develop anything in medical devices. Each device is unique. Car, in the automotive industry, at least you have a car which basically 4 wheels and motor. But if you look at medical devices, cardiovascular devices are totally different than orthopedics. If you look at catheters, they have no connection with orthopedics, right? There's a huge variety of products in medical devices, which makes it very interesting, very complex from that perspective. So your learning has to be very quick, very fast, and your domain knowledge in specific areas will certainly help developing products in that domain. And switching domains also not that easy. If somebody spent like 20 years in orthopedics, they would know the jargons of not only orthopedic itself is very big. When I started spine, I thought spine is one, but later on I realized that spine has lumbar spine, thoracic spine, and cervical spine, and each of these areas are unique. How we operate, what kind of devices we put in. So it is very interesting. As you start learning, going deeper into this, I think you will enjoy it. So that's my few cents, Salman, here.
Just one point to add quick here, Kuldeep. So depending on the class of the device in medical devices, so you either go for 510K or PMA, and if you go for PMA, then you'll have to, there's a clinical trials involved. So that's very, very different than if you are going for clinical trials. So that is one thing I
Absolutely.
think unique to medical devices.
Very good point. Over to you, Ankit.
Sure. Thank you, Salman and Kuldeep, for sparing amount of time you people shared with us, and thank you for valuable informations on new product development and new medical device development. Now we will be closing this webinar session. You can ask your questions, or if you need any help from us, you can reach out to me on my mail ID given on the slide in front of you, and you can reach out to us from our website, contact us page as well. And now I will just share a few polls for taking feedback from you guys to make our other webinars valuable to you. So here are the polls. Okay, I will move to next one. Okay, so thank you guys uh, for your time, and thank you Salman and Kuldeep, valuable time especially, and spending this valuable duration with us. Now, see you in our next webinar, and till then, Merry Christmas. We are close to Christmas. Merry Christmas to everyone, and have a good day.
Thanks, Ankit. Thanks for organizing. It's great to share as a panelist with you, Salman. And Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to everyone.
Thank you, Kuldeep. Thanks, Ankit, for organizing. Merry Christmas to everybody, and good night, and have a good day. Bye.